As Mike said, welcome and thank you very much for joining us on the National Education Union's rep call this evening. I really hope that some of you have managed some rest during this holiday. I know it's been a difficult time with our checklist coming out right at the end of term. That was because we waited for government guidance and we wanted to update based on what the government was saying. So we do apologise for that, but we know that many of you have been filling those out in the summer holidays and have been having discussions and conversations within your schools during this time. So we want to say thank you. It is unprecedented times. We wouldn't normally be asking you to do that, but a huge thank you, not just for doing that, but also for the hard work that we have been doing since the beginning in March. If you are brand new as a rep, then you are absolutely welcome. And if you've been a rep for a long time, then you are equally welcome. We are a lay-led union and we depend and we thrive on having amazing people in our nurseries, schools and colleges up and down the country. We as a union have been working hard in the summer on behalf of members, and we hope that this evening's call will give you an insight into that information, but also give you an opportunity to ask questions of us. I'm just going to run through some housekeeping. My name is Amanda Martin. I'm the president of the National Education Union. This call is being recorded, and as I said on the previous one, not just for the press to have a look at, but also for our members that can't make this call, we will be putting this out on our YouTube channel so that you can have a look and catch up on those. But also we use it to inform us of the information we put out and to go back on the questions that we don't always get to answer during the call. In the chat, there is a behaviour code has been posted. Please adhere to that during this Zoom call this evening. We are in a webinar format, so those of you who have written in the chat said, I can't see myself, I'm very sorry. It is only the panellists that you're able to see. That way we can have as many people participating in this type of format. But we really do want you to join in, and it's great to see the chat of people saying hello and welcoming each other in that chat. But in there, we will also post any links to anything that we talk about, or if you have any technical questions, as Mike said, please do post those in there and we will do our best to answer. We also want you to begin to ask questions in the Q&A button. Please say your name and where you're from so that our panelists can refer to you when they're answering the questions, should they need to. We have an amazing tech team today made up of Lawson Armstrong, Marie Burton, Andy Jackson, Mike Jocelyn and Henry Fowler. And we also have a signer in Sam Riddle. You'll have the three panellists you'll be able to see is one of your General Secretaries, Kevin Courtney. We also have Jane Phillips, Head of Employment Rights Unit, and Mark Holding, who is the Assistant General Secretary for Organising and Learning. Kevin's going to give a brief introduction around September opening, pay, exams, and a general update on where we are at as a National Education Union. And then we will have assistance from Jane and Mark during your questions and answers. So without further ado, good evening, Kevin.
Evening, Amanda, and thanks very much to you for your introduction. You've been brilliant as our president throughout the whole of this year. And thanks to everyone else who's joined the call this evening. I echo what Amanda said, hope you've had some restful break across this summer and the last few days before schools open. There's no doubt that this term is going to be hard work for everybody, teachers and support staff back at school, and for you in your role as a rep as well, and for every other part of the union. Mary sends you her greetings today. She isn't on the panel today. She's directly addressing our concerns to government, but we both know we've got many members who are desperate to be back at work, and we have others, and sometimes the same people, who are extremely concerned about their personal safety. The personal safety of our members is a top priority for us. And we have a government that has so far not shown itself to be in charge of the virus. So we think we should continue to be proud of the work that we did last term and since last March, which kept schools and staff safer, kept our NHS running and stopped it from being overwhelmed. We kept schools closed while virus levels fell, or while test, track, trace at least got started. And it is true now that the virus levels are currently much lower than they were at the peak in March and April, and that does make things safer than then. But that's not uniform across the country, and I want to return to that, it's important. But because the virus levels generally are lower, the balance of risks has shifted in reality and in the public consciousness. So large members of people are now worried about their jobs, the effect of continuing shutdown. Many parents with children at home since March are concerned about the impact on them. And in addition, Public Health England is supporting the government guidance on reopening schools. So it's clear the vast majority of schools will open in September, and we support that. It would be a foolish position for us to advocate that they do not open. We wouldn't succeed, we'd look weaker, and many of our members wouldn't agree with it. Instead, in these circumstances, the key thing is that we have to be seen, all of us in the union, to be the people who are in favour of education, in favour of schools opening and remaining open, and also the people who are demanding that the government takes every step to keep R down, to allow schools to open. It's absolutely clear that we can't allow the R rate to go above 1, or the case number will increase again. And no matter how irresponsible our government is, they cannot be satisfied with that. It'll lead to another lockdown, another closure of the economy. So as well as being the people who are looking for the safety of our members, being in favour of the opening of schools, there's also a big space for us to be seen as the people who demand that the government take action to stop the R rate being above 1 so that schools can open and remain open. Now, as I said earlier, cases are quite low at the moment in much of the country. Nevertheless, across the whole country, there is justly going to be a huge concern about safety and a huge role for us, everyone in the union, especially our workplace reps and our branch secretaries, in supporting supporting members and schools through these questions about safety. Because national averages always hide significant regional variations. There are areas of the country where the case rate is much higher. There are areas of the country where R is above 1, and there are individual teachers and support staff who are at much higher risks than others. So we also have to be seen as the people most concerned about the safety of staff. Now that's sort of a general introduction. We have been working on things over the summer that we think can really help in this situation. We hope to be able to publish very early on in the first half of September a website that will look like our School Cuts website, that will give information about the local case rate in the area of each school. We have staff working hard right now to get that information to be as local as possible, for it to show trends in data and for it to be resistant to attacks that it's scaremongering. You'll know, if you were involved in the School Cuts campaign, we were really proud of the quality of the data on that School Cuts website, and we could always defend it. We want that to be true on this data as well. So there's serious work going on with that website, which will come into fruition hopefully in that first bit of September, to get the right data and make it as reliable as possible. The government already publishes data about cases per 100,000 in local authority areas, which we will publish on there, but it's now not the only data that's available. You may have seen in recent weeks, and this is a good thing the government has done, they are now publishing the raw number of new cases in each of around 7,000 MSOAs, they call them, media super output areas. It's an area about the same size as a council ward. And that is much more fine-grained data. It tells you what sort of situation your school is in, and that will be very useful for us in any conversation we're having with local authorities or with head teachers in your school, and for you to have those conversations. I'll return to that data. Because the other thing we've been doing across the summer is working on a suite of documents about what happens if things start to go wrong in your school, about what routes for escalation you should have, who should you turn to first, where do we go to next? And these documents are now all on the website, under the Corona pages of the NEU website. And we're going to email you links to all of them tomorrow, and to all the other reps who aren't on the call today. And these documents deal with our core concerns about safety. And so in summary, that's about the consultation that every head teacher should have had with union reps and staff by now, and most heads have, some haven't. It deals with putting in place the proper plans for enhanced overnight daily cleaning, the plans for one-way systems in schools, the plans to provide appropriate PPE to staff if they're working in close personal contact, and we're going to come on to the question of CV and CEV people. It deals with the fact that head teachers must conduct individual risk assessments for staff who are clinically extremely vulnerable, and clinically vulnerable, or increased risk, in particular older staff, disabled staff, black staff. So there have to be individual risk assessments and what happens if you don't get those. We also want to ensure on these documents that we have that all the staff listed as clinically extremely vulnerable, we believe that they should still be working from home in September. That is happening by and large in Scotland after 2 weeks of opening. We want that to be the situation here. For people who aren't quite clinically extremely vulnerable, but clinically vulnerable or have other higher risks, they must be in a situation where they must at all times be secure in being 2 meters distant from other staff, and in secondary schools from pupils as well. Our red lines also deal with the fact that heads and local authorities have to have in place contingency plans in the event of what happens if there is an in-school outbreak, or if you're in an area where there is a local spike. These documents are extremely well worked. They're on the website. They flow through the different stages. I'm sure we'll be asked questions about them today, but they are there on the website, and we would like you to spend some time looking at them, looking through the website, familiarising yourself with them, and being ready to share them with colleagues in your school when you need to, and then also talking with your branch secretary about them. We think these documents can give members confidence that their union is there supporting them. We're also working with the other education unions as much as we can, and certainly Unison and GMB are likely to use the same escalation guidance as us. We'll look at what the other unions are saying as well. So that work is done. Coming back to the website that we will be able to launch, we hope, very early on. We think the information that we put on it will actually be quite reassuring in large areas of the country, probably in the majority of cases. And at least at first, it will show the low numbers of cases in the ward, in that sort of area that your school is situated again in. So to give you some examples of that, there are about 25,000 schools in England, and 14,000, so that's more than half, are in a ward where there were no COVID cases at all last week, in the weeks that and we record them week by week. 85% of schools are in wards with less than 20 cases per 100,000 as we work it out, and those are low levels. 95% less than 50 cases per 100,000. But then there are some, so in the majority of cases, there is some reassurance in that. Not complete reassurance, but some reassurance. But then there are the schools in much higher COVID incidence areas. 5% of schools that are in areas with more than 50 cases per 100,000. 1.5% of schools, they're included in that 5%, 1.5% of schools in areas where there's more than 100 cases per 100,000. And again, including that 5%, including that 1.5%, 0.3% of schools that are in areas where there are more than 200 cases per 100,000. That's 87 schools in that top category. And it's important that we look at those differences, because arguments will work better in some situations than others. Now, I want to say again, listing that fact that there are areas where there's low numbers is in no way a suggestion from us that we shouldn't be concerned. We have to be concerned in those areas to keep those cases down. It does mean, though, most of the time there is very little chance of anybody in your school having COVID. But every checklist has to be followed, because you never know when there is a case of COVID. Every part of the checklist has to be followed. Staff have to do social distancing. We need everything there to be running so that cases don't get up. It's not a normal situation anywhere. And in the schools with higher rates, the area, it's markedly different. So we have to respond to that as well. Now, we think this website will be really a big news. We think lots of parents will look at it. We think the press will talk about it. We're going to have to get it right. And it will show that in some areas the cases are much higher. So in one ward in Northampton, and there is a school in that ward, there were 208 positive tests in the last week we had figures for. And that was nearly 20% of all the positive tests in the country. That's a huge level. You can't just go on the number, though. We're asking our branches to be talking to local public health officials and local councils, because sometimes there's local information you need. In that case in Northampton, almost all of those cases were in one sandwich factory. It's quite celebrated. It's a Marks and Spencer's sandwich factory. The cases spread through there. Now all the workers there are supposed to be self-isolating along with their families, so hopefully cases will fall. But if you're in an area where those cases are high and we don't know what's the linking factor and you can't work on it, then there are real concerns in those situations. So we're publishing that information. We think parents will be interested in it, and we think you'll be interested in it, and we'll give our branches some real purchase with the local council and Public Health England. You will also be really keen to follow what sort of area your council is in. The government is dividing all of your councils into 4 categories. Areas of intervention, that's the top concern. And currently that's about 10 local authorities in the Northwest and the East Midlands. We're going to have all this information on the website when we launch it. You're probably aware of it already. And then below that, areas of enhanced support. These are areas that the government thinks, Public Health think, are at risk of becoming areas of intervention. There's only a couple of those at the moment, but Birmingham, one of the biggest local authorities in the country, is one of those. Then below that, the next tier down is areas of concern where they've got a bit more, markedly more than average cases, and where they're asking the councils to put extra steps in place. And then there's the rest where the government thinks the cases are quite low. Now, local authorities move up and down that chart on a weekly basis. So it's like the top 20 of the pop charts, local authorities moving up and down on there. And we are pressing government for further action on schools, the possibility of rota operation, etc., especially in the areas of intervention, if that's needed in order to get cases falling. And we're also going to be pressing for extra support for clinically vulnerable people in schools in those sorts of areas. We're going to ask our branches, your branch secretaries, to engage with the local chief executives of the councils and public health officials using that data so they can keep in touch with where there are these local outbreaks. When they say that, there's a problem in a town like Oldham, on this data, you can see that it's in some areas in Oldham and not in other areas in Oldham, and that gives us a real chance to focus. I think you can also imagine that this pattern of local variation will lead to patterns of different parental behaviour. And I anticipate, don't know, but that more parents will choose to keep their children at home in those higher level areas. And if that's the case, then it'll be easier to make an argument that vulnerable staff could be at home supporting those children that are at home. So if you're a rep in a school that's high on the levels that parents aren't sending their kids in, and you've got CEV people who want to be at home, the head was originally saying they can't, this is part of an argument to say that they should be allowed to. It gives us more information to use to press with local head teachers. If the council doesn't have measures in hand that can reduce the number of cases, it will also in those areas lead to arguments for targeted closure, like in Leicester before the summer holiday, or rota operations, etc. So all those things we've been working on to try and help you as reps and help our members cope with this unprecedented situation. We know that you have been working so hard for your members during this period, and we know that many of you have completed the checklist already. So we would like you, if you haven't, to do the checklist. And if you did it early in the summer, it might be worth revisiting it. We've had thousands of them completed. That information is sort of automatically collated. We tell your branches which schools have got completed checklists. That helps. It also allows us with our national work, so please do that. We want you to send a completed checklist with checklist letter 2. This is one of the letters on the website at the moment. So if you look at the website, you'll see the checklist. You'll see the letters to send if members are not happy, if you're not happy with the core safety concerns. So we've got those on there. There are feedback checklists. We want you to feed back concerns from the checklist to members with particular focus on talking to clinically extremely vulnerable, and higher risk members. We want you to try as much as you can to maintain a collective union discussion about this. We know things are safer for younger members of staff and without clinical vulnerabilities. And we know they are more at risk if you're in a clinically vulnerable, if you're a pregnant woman in the 3rd trimester. We want the whole group saying, we want the head teacher to look after these people properly. We want you to ask members to report to you any things they see around the school that aren't as COVID secure as they think they could be. You know, if they spot something where there's an issue, or if something that was a plan looks like they can spot that the plan isn't working, to report them to you so that you can have a constant dialogue with your local head teacher in trying to improve them as much as you can. If there are core concerns from the checklist, then we want you to meet with the school head or the college head, principal, and to talk about how they're addressed. We think in most cases, heads will respond positively. If they're not, then we want you to talk to your branch officer or to the regional office about where we go next. Now, we don't believe that we can be wise enough to know how things are going to develop, all the issues that are going to come up. We think all of us in the union are going to have to work together to get things right, and sharing information at a local level in a rep WhatsApp group, you sharing information with other reps and with other branch secretaries, finding out what's happening, your branch secretary sharing it up with region and to national, so that we see the pattern of what's developing and we can improve our advice, press government on issues that are coming up. We really need to know your experiences to know how we can adapt things to best suit. We are continuing to work with other unions as much as we can on further demands that we'll make as things go forward. And we want to be planning around our 10-point plan for education recovery that we launched in June, where we said that the government should be employing more teachers and finding more teaching spaces. Because if it starts to go wrong, we want it to be the government's problem. We've opened schools, we've done everything we can, but they should have been investing more. We want them to invest more in test, track, trace and isolate. And crucially, we want them to be much clearer what actions they will take and what actions they will support us taking, or what actions they'll support leaders taking in schools, especially in the higher rate areas. So our general line, we think it's right that it should be that schools should open. We think that's the best place for us to be. We think that gives us much more purchase in particular areas or for particular people if we need something that's harder than that. And we think that we were right to call for schools to close in March when the virus was out of control. That was the right thing to do. We've always wanted schools to open as soon as it was safe to do so. It was right for us to publish our 5 tests. The government has not fully met those 5 tests. Progress has been made. We think it is right to open schools, but government has to still be working on all of those matters. And we really want to stress the government has responsibilities, and we, working with you, will keep the pressure on the government to meet those responsibilities. They've got to keep the virus under control. They've got to keep the R rate below 1 in every area. Cases have to be falling or further steps have to be taken. We think it's vital that we keep the pressure on the government on all of those questions, on test, track, trace, on doing studies in schools now to see what's happening, on reporting the data about that, on reviewing the regulations around staggered starts, etc., based on what's actually happening, and on the vitalness of supporting our vulnerable members in the schools. We think it would really give confidence about school reopening if the government to be much clearer about the actions that will be taken when a school is in an area where case numbers are high and going up. And we've been pressing that on government in meetings recently and getting support from council leaders in those meetings. So there'll be lots of questions on that, I know, but I do want to say brief things about exams and about pay, because these will be issues that will come up in school and we might not be able to get back together again. So I'd like to just say something briefly. The pay award that came in the summer, it was not a reward for our COVID. It was a pay award that was a year in the planning by government, but we have agreed a 2020 pay spine with ASCL, the secondary, Association of School and College Leaders, and NAHT, National Association of Head Teachers. We've got a common pay spine with them, which comes from the government advice, and we are printing it and sending it to every school. We want every school to do that. NAHT and ASCL have agreed with us that we are advising all schools. So between us, we represent almost every head teacher in the country, and we are advising schools which pay below. There are new advisory pay points. Instead of they got rid of M1, M2, M3, M4 and M5 and didn't have any guidance. Now the government has put them back by advisory points. And we are agreeing, the three unions agreeing to advise schools which are paying below the advisory points to move immediately to paying people on those points. Some schools might be paying more, and we're advising them collectively to give teachers the right percentage rise rather than scaling back to the advisory points. At the right point in the next couple of weeks, we are going to send you materials about that, asking you to approach your head to seek confirmation that they are going to do the pay rise, that they'll do what all the unions are saying, for you to report that back to members, and also to press on this thing that we're saying, the COVID should not be used as an excuse not to give pay progression. We want pay progression for everybody. We've got a small exception if somebody's already on a capability procedure, but essentially that everybody gets pay progression. Interestingly, we have had confirmation that a few other MATs are moving to drop PRP altogether. We've heard from Elliot recently. So I hope you don't mind me taking some time to that. And then on exams, what a mess we have had from the government. The fiasco has been so dreadful. And what we think is that we think it's important to say, this isn't an aberration. Actually, it's a revelation of how poorly our exams work every year. The one person who should resign is staying put, whilst the senior civil servants around them have to go. It was Gavin Williamson and Nick Gibb who gave the directions to Ofqual that they had to stop grade inflation this year as their prime consideration. And that automatically meant their second direction, that students should have fair grades, couldn't happen because there weren't enough good grades to go round once the small centres have been given grades based on centre assessment. Boris Johnson, on the day of the results, called the algorithm robust and dependable. Yesterday, he changed his mind and called it mutant. You really couldn't make this up. So your union, and we need your help with this, we're doing two things about it. One is we are going to launch an education commission, a commission to look at this. We're going to get external experts, and we're going to be working on this across the next few weeks and months so that we've got really reputable studies out before next year, because we are really worried that they will repeat these problems next year. And the second thing, and we need your immediate help with this, we've got a petition which now has more than 55,000 signatures calling for the government to reduce syllabus content to GCSEs and A-levels for this year, so that children are examined on the content they have been taught, not on the content they haven't been taught. We think there'll be a really discriminatory effect if that doesn't happen, because some private schools have been able to maintain teaching with smaller class sizes on Zoom, etc. And we've got that demand, and also a demand because we think there is a chance of another lockdown and exams not happening. We want a robust national system of moderated centre assessed grades next year. That petition's got more than 55,000 signatures in a couple of days. We'd really like you to promote it to members in your school and college. We are also going to be saying lots of stuff about SATs, the phonics test during this year. But if you can all help, both from primary and secondary sectors, to get that petition going, that would be very good. We're confident most of the questions are going to be about COVID and return. We welcome that. So thanks very much for listening and letting me talk about those other two things as well.
Thank you, Kevin. And before we move on, just watching over the chat, I'm just going to say on behalf of the National Education Union that we are sending sincere love and solidarity to those who've not just professionally but personally been affected by this, whether families, friends and colleagues. We realise that on top of the professional issues, there are also some personal issues that are happening. So we want to send our love and solidarity to those people. A couple of other points. Kevin mentioned around pregnancy. We've had a number of questions come in on that. The Royal Society of Obstetricians did put out some guidance to say around the third trimester, or if you have underlying health conditions, and the DFE are following that guidance. We've put the link in the chat for those. It has been on the website, so please do update yourself on that. And there's also been some questions around the various sectors that the union covers. We're going to try to cover as many questions as we can today, but we are offering sector Zooms. They are planned. The first one was yesterday, which was the independent sector sector, and we will be moving on with the other sectors that the union covers as we go through the next few weeks. I'm going to go straight on with questions. We've got nearly 1,200 of you on the call, so as you can imagine, the questions are coming thick and fast. So Lisa asks, how will we deal with ventilation, especially in the winter months? Some of our classrooms have windows that only open an inch or so. Some classrooms are heated by aircon. She also asked, will we be pressing for routine taking of temperatures? And do we think masks in corridors in local lockdown areas is adequate? And isn't it wrong to leave whole school mandatory mask wearing to head teachers unfair on our head members? Anne asks, the World Health Organization said people over 60 should wear full PPE. Is the union going to push for this? And Mark asks, have the 5 tests been met? If not, what do we do now? And I'm going to come to you first, Kevin, and then I'll bring in Jane Phillips and then Mark Holding. Kevin.
Thank you very much. So Lisa's questions about ventilation and aircon. These are going to be really important questions during the autumn term. The government acknowledges we need ventilation. They haven't created a situation where we're going to have ventilation. And the World Health Organization thinks we need ventilation. So we will be demanding that the government is measuring what's happening in schools. And if the virus rate starts to rise because we can't have ventilation, then there have to be consequences of that. So we need to be really on that. We're going to be on that as the union. We need your feedback on it as those things develop. But we will be looking at that, and our website that is going to look at that local data will reveal patterns of that and will give us a real ability to focus and talk to the press and talk to government about that. Now, the question of masks. I think this is an important question. And the question of what should happen to people aged over 60, which was the second question, I think, about PPE. In all my media interviews, Mary and I have a week on, week off system of media interviews. So I've been on this week. We've been talking about the face mask question. We've been going back to the World Health Organization advice because we think it's important to refer back to scientific advice. And we've been supporting, therefore, the idea that in those areas of intervention, that all children should wear face masks in the corridors. If that delays, if that stops some spread, that will be a worthwhile sacrifice. It will be interesting to know what members think in other lower case rate areas of the country, because the World Health Organization isn't saying that should happen elsewhere. Our position is going to be, at the moment, that if members in a school think their school systems aren't working well enough, that the one-way systems aren't working well enough, that the corridors aren't the right space, and that the school group thinks that masks should be worn in secondary schools, we're going to say we support them in doing that. The question, we want government to be clearer. We don't want there to be discretion for heads. We think that's the government avoiding the responsibility. But while the heads have that discretion, then we can use it in the way that I just described. I've also been referring in all of those calls to what the World Health Organization said about staff, where they said, as the questioner asked, somebody aged over 60. Now, we know that 2% of teachers, there are government figures on this, 2% of teachers are aged over 60. And they said that people over 60 or otherwise vulnerable should wear medical grade masks. So we've been asking in every media call for the government to respond to that. But that is something that could be taken up at a school level in risk assessments now. And we've been talking about this at some depth in head office, because we don't want that medical grade masks to become the reason why clinically extremely vulnerable people should be in school. We think clinically extremely vulnerable people should be at home, and we think we are getting that in lots of schools. So we don't want a soft option on that question. We want clinically extremely vulnerable to be at home. Mark asks, are our 5 tests met? And I said in my presentation, they aren't met. There is progress towards them, but they aren't met. So we are demanding the government continues to take action on all of those. It is safer, and in many areas of the country, cases are low. Like I said, more than half the schools are in the country are in a ward where there were no cases recorded in last week. And that was nothing like that earlier on. So we think it is right to be back, but we have to press the government on all of those things. And if those 5 tests start to become less met, then that's a really big thing for us to be talking about. We will be on the case of these things, but we don't think that we don't think it would be sensible for us now to try and say the 5 tests aren't met, schools don't open. We think we'd be smashed up over that. And we think most members wouldn't support it.
Thank you, Kevin. Jane, can I bring you in to cover some of those areas? Would you unlock Jane, please, so she can speak? Mike. Thank you.
Thanks,
Evening,
Amanda.
Jane.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I think one thing that was asked was about the taking of temperatures. I think the general view is that nobody's really convinced that that's an accurate way of checking whether people have symptoms, especially with young children. They're most likely to be asymptomatic. So I'm not sure there is much gained from routine taking of temperatures, but that possibly is my personal view. Much of what is happening and what is going to happen in September is really around now. Our view is around we need to collectivise around these issues. We need to collectivise around protecting clinically extremely vulnerable members, putting pressure on schools to allow those people to work from home. And so we've changed tact. And Kevin has explained really why we've changed tact. Previously, in June, we were saying you can rely on the Section 44 protection, which says you don't have to go into work in a dangerous workplace. It's very difficult for us to say that now because of the levels of infection. So that kind of Section 44, which is a bit of shorthand, is not necessarily the position that we are taking. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Things will have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So there's a need, I think, for all of you to discuss with your branches and with your regional offices where you have situations in particular involving clinically extremely vulnerable, clinically vulnerable and high risk, whether it's appropriate to rely on Section 44 and whether letters should be issued. The alternative, as I say, is for us to collectivise, and in certain circumstances, it may be more powerful for us to say that we're going to ballot members over possible industrial action. So you will see when you look at the resources on the website, they are different to what they were in June, but that is, as I say, because we have got this slight change of tact, and Section 44 isn't quite the way forward in our view in some of these cases.
Thank you, Jane. And Mark, can I bring you in just to cover anything that Kevin and Jane haven't?
So just to kind of emphasise a little bit about how this would work in the context of the escalation guidance we've posted on the website today, and we'll send you a link to tomorrow, although I think we've posted a link already into the chat. So as Kevin said, all of these things are elements of our detailed checklist. They're all things that you should be reviewing as part of the planning for the opening in September or next week. But also I would stress the checklist is there as a tool for you to review how that opening is going throughout the autumn term, and you should be revisiting with the school leadership as the reality of the school being open becomes more apparent. And things like ventilation you might not understand the shape of that issue, or the kind of whether the one-way system is working, whether people are able to maintain any semblance of 2 metre social distancing, particularly between adults in school and so on. So you should be using it as a vehicle to review. But within that, when you look at our escalation guidance and the associated letters, particularly what we call checklist letter 2, you will see that from the detail of the checklist, we've identified a dozen or so core safety concerns that you should particularly pay attention to. And we've pulled those out against the backdrop of the context that Jane has just explained about where we believe the basis for a kind of an escalation of last resort around Section 44, or indeed around indicative ballots for industrial action, would be the strongest. So that includes things like the need to consult with yourselves over the risk assessment, but it also is around the provision of appropriate PPE for staff working in close personal contact with pupils, whose behaviour creates a significant risk. It specifically includes the need for individual risk assessments for staff, particularly for the clinically extremely vulnerable, those that are clinically vulnerable and those at higher risk. And that, of course, would include those who are over 60, and any risk assessment that doesn't take account of what the existing World Health Organization is advice for any of those categories, e.g. the need for wearing medical face masks, would not be a fit and proper individual risk assessment. And all those things will be the basis to escalate. And there is also on the website described for you the steps you can take as an escalation process. But if those matters are not resolved, then they're all things that you might want to escalate beyond what's on the website. And that's where you should have an active discussion with your branch and your regional office about how you might collectivize around those issues and work towards that section 44 or that indicative ballot. And all those things will only be as strong as the union group support in your school. That's the case for everything. And that's why we've all been stressing on the call the importance to involve as many members as possible, not just those who are at most risk. The purpose of a union is that the strong protect the weak. In this instance, that's about those who are the lowest risk, protecting those of highest risk. So even if you've got individual members who are the most anxious, it's very important that you are actively engaging with the wider membership in your school about how they can support measures in the school that protect those who are at higher risk. That's what this is all about. That's what your role is all about. That's what we've done so effectively from the beginning of the lockdown. It might be harder to do that in September, but it's going to be just as important.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Some really detailed answers there, but I think it's important. So, because otherwise sometimes we get further questioning. And so hopefully that would have covered some of those questions that are coming in. I've got some more. Amanda from Walsall. How can we support staff who were issued shielding letters earlier this year from their GP who do not feel safe coming back to work in classrooms? This particularly could relate to secondary schools where we expected to work across multiple year group bubbles. Then Baljit has asked, are staff entitled to union representation during individual risk assessment meetings? Also, some staff are asking for adjustments that my school cannot guarantee due to building size, for example, and the guidance also is not clear. If a compromise cannot be agreed, what avenues could members take? And scrolling down because I've got some more. Helen asks, what is the advice on performance management reviews and target setting for the coming year? Should pay progression be automatic this year? And a final one for the moment is Hayley. Our school has told staff that they have to supervise students for half an hour each day during the lunch break. I understood that we weren't paid to work during lunch break, so couldn't be directed to do this. Is this correct? So I'll take those four first. Kevin, I'll come to you first of all.
Yeah, thanks very much, Amanda. So shielding, people with shielding letters, people who got shielding letters were clinically extremely vulnerable. So we've got a clash of advice here because the government has, and Public Health England have backed the government in saying that shielding is over. We, however, are saying that clinically extremely vulnerable people we think they're in a different position in a school setting where it's hard to have social distancing and we don't have very good PPE. So we think clinically extremely vulnerable people should still be at home. Now, general government advice is that shielding is over, but it still says that clinically extremely vulnerable people should work from home if possible. So that's the general government advice. They've weakened that a bit in education. We want to press that clinically extremely vulnerable people should still be at home. We think we have to do that collectively in the way that Mark and Jane have just been talking about. We want the whole school group to say, look, Mrs. M, we know she's really vulnerable. We want her to be able to work from home. We'll have to look for partly for local arguments. We think that we'll find next week that there are plenty of kids still at home, especially in the higher risk areas. So there'll be work that could be done from home. So we want to make that collective case that they should be allowed to work from home. We will have to recognise the government guide, the fact that the Public Health England changed their guidance is a material factor, but we're still pressing for it. And we know in Scotland that most clinically extremely vulnerable staff are at home. So that's what we want to achieve here. Baljit's question about whether people are entitled to representation at risk assessment meetings. I guess I think we should say that we've got a right to represent and that we want to be there if the people want you to. And if you think that's the right relationship in your school, I'm not sure what the legal is, and maybe somebody else can add to that. But the key thing is, and Baljeet also said, what if the changes they're looking for can't be done? And we have to go back to my previous answer on that. With the government changing the advice, there'll be slightly less backup for them just saying, well, I'm not coming in then. So it's collectively that we have to press on those questions. And it's easier to press, more important to press as well, in the areas where the cases are higher. So it is coming back to that sort of collective and reporting back to us what the sorts of situations are so that we can carry on making public noise about it at the national level. The pay progression question, the question might have been asked before I said it, or it might have been missed in what I said, but absolutely, there are 3 things that we want to happen in every school this term. We want everybody to get the percentage pay rise that the government has announced. We want all schools to move at least to the advisory points that the government has put out and that we've now shared with ASCL and NAHT. And we want everybody to make, so we're talking about teachers going through the teacher pay progression system. Our advice will also be the same on support staff, but there is the particular process that happens at this time of year. We want every teacher to make progression. They shouldn't be held back because of COVID. We have that one exception if they were already on a capability procedure. We don't say that they shouldn't make pay progression, but we're not saying that in every circumstance they would. But that's something that we, again, it's collective. We'll take action on it. We'll support people take action on it if they're up for that at the school level. And lunchtime supervision. So there are bits of law on this that aren't suspended. Every teacher has a right to a break of reasonable length during the middle of the school day, and no teacher can be required to do lunchtime supervision without being paid for it and without having a separate contract for that. So those are places to stand in that discussion about that. The question of what the head is aiming for, how much teachers and other staff support it, whether there are any quid pro quos around that. But what we can't allow to happen is that we just do all the work we were doing before, then we're doing more work because of COVID, and then maybe we're even being asked to do work supporting the kids that are at home. That can't happen. It's not a normal situation, and we can't do everything that we were doing before. And your workload, especially at this time of major stress, really matters. And so these are issues to talk about with your members in the school, but those bits of law are there, and they can absolutely be relied on, as can our willingness to back you in that. And but you talking to members and going back to the head saying we're not happy about that. That's not the way we think we should do it. Let's have a talk about a better way of doing it if that's where your members are.
Okay, thank you.
I see people in the chat suggesting they've agreed reductions in lunchtime with reductions in time at the end of the school day. So there's been bargaining going on around those sorts of questions already. Have a look in the chat at other solutions that people are coming up with.
I think that's a really good point, Kevin. It is about collectivising, it is about communication, and it is about negotiations. And as a trade union, those are our core things that we need to be doing. So it's really good to see some reps sharing some great ideas in there. I'm going to come to Jane a little bit more on risk assessments, and then Mark on pay.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, there was just a couple of points that I wanted to make. First of all, I think it's really important that people understand that this is an ongoing process, and you need to keep ensuring that measures are in place and are working in accordance with risk assessments. We're absolutely adamant that, particularly for clinically vulnerable and high risk, including pregnant women, there should be individual risk assessments carried out. If it's for a pregnant woman, if the risk assessment can't reduce the risks sufficiently, then by law, and it's the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations, she is entitled to be suspended from work on health and safety grounds on full pay. The other thing I think that also needs to be to be borne in mind is that there may well be clinically extremely vulnerable people that feel compelled to go into school, and their situation will need to be kept under review if there is a case in the school, if there's a suspected case in the school, and if local rates go up. I think with the clinically extremely vulnerable people, I do think it's really important that they take advice from their GP. It's probably worthwhile them speaking to their GP about the risk assessment, but I think it would hopefully be pretty powerful if a GP's advice is that they should be working from home. We would hope that that will be sufficient, but if not, it goes back to collectivising that issue if necessary.
Thank you, Jane. And Mark, just on pay.
Just very briefly to say that the three flanks of the pay campaign that Kevin's referred to in his answer in the previous presentation about the pay spine, the automatic pay progression, and people receiving their pay increase in full. The email that we send you tomorrow with the links to the escalation guidance will include a reminder of a link to the web page that's specifically focused on that pay campaign. So you'll get further advice and information about exactly what you might need to do and how you would escalate around both the safety issues and the pay issues in the email tomorrow.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for that. It's good to have that reminder. Okay, I've got some more questions. So Louise in Kirklees, hello. It says, what is the union guidance on staff meetings and if we should be holding full staff or department meetings in person? Then I've got Kate. Can I ask for the head to speak to me as NEU rep if the school does not recognise the union? They're an independent school which refuses to recognise the union. And then Penny asks, our MAT has a 12-point pay scale, so we end up moving up one pay grade every 2 years. Is this acceptable? And Sarah is asking, is it right that we won't be told if a child is found positive and it will be confidential? It happened in lockdown and we were told we could not be told because it is confidential. So I'll come to Kevin first and then Jane and...
Thanks very much. Those are 4 fantastic questions. Staff meetings should definitely not be held in person. I mean, maybe if you did it in the whole staff, in the whole hall and everybody was 4 meters away from one another, but it is not a sensible thing to do. The Public Health England review that came out last weekend, which looked at the outbreaks that happened in schools last summer, 24,000 schools open. They traded a lot on there only being 30 outbreaks. That is quite a small number. An outbreak is 2 or more cases, but half the cases were staff-to-staff transmission. Staff-to-staff transmission will be a really important thing for us to look at. So you can't be meeting lots of people in person. That breaks all of the rules. It's not a sense, and then everyone's talking in those meetings as well. So having aerosol droplets, etc. So we don't support staff meetings in person. The question about Kate's question from an independent school, the union not, the school not recognising the union. And Kate asks, can she ask the head to meet? And absolutely, you know, if they're not recognised, they don't legally have to meet. You do have legal rights to represent any member in the school. And in this country, the unions have a right to represent in any individual thing that comes up. So you have absolute rights to represent, but the school could be meeting with you and the school group could say to management, okay, you haven't recognised us, but at this moment, we really think it's important that we have a way of collectively talking to you about our opinions about COVID. And I think that would be a good thing for you to press on. I'm not saying you want to push this nuclear button, but we could take strike action over the fact that they don't recognise. We have recognition actually in most independent schools and very good relationships. So I've given you the nuclear button there as well, but the management, we should be saying to them, they should meet with us. And I think you should get the union group members to say that that should happen. Penny's question about her mat. This is outrageous, I think. I mean, well, I might not have quite got it right, but a 12-point pay spine, whereas M1 to M6, the old spine points, was 6 points. Now, we were hearing cases, there are some cases where we've heard of this, of them putting half points in and saying everybody will make 2 points a year. But it's being used in practice to delay people's progression up the pay spine. We do not support that. We think it's absolutely wrong. We've put out these advisory points with NAHT and ASCL. They have 6 points, and we would like to take up with your Matt that they should move to that. They should move to that 6-point pay spine, and we'll support you in taking that up. And Sarah's question, people using data protection to say you can't know whether that child is positive or not. There are other things at play here. There is health protection. If somebody was positive, then we need to identify all the close contacts of that positive person. That has to happen. And if there are 2 cases, we're going to be closing it. But, you know, so they can't use data protection to tell you that. Maybe in not telling you, maybe they're indicating that the person wasn't positive. But they have to, there has to be information for health protection purposes, and it has to be freely available in the school. We have to know where there are cases so that people can be identified for contact tracing.
Thank you. Jane?
I don't think I've got anything else to add. I think it's ridiculous. You can't keep it confidential if you're going to advise all those in close contact with the person to isolate. So, yeah, that just seems crazy.
Thank you very much. Mark, anything further, or I'll take 2 more questions?
Just one line, really. Katie, from the Independent School on Recognition. This is a good time when people have got a widely felt, deeply felt issue. So if you could email organise at neu.org.uk, we'll get some organising support to you to support you on a longer term campaign for recognition.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, 2 more. Jeremy asks, hi, in the absence of a mandate for industrial action, could we have more information and reassurance, please, about legal support for staff refusing to work under Section 44? And Viola asks, what is the NET stand on workload during these times? The government wants us to keep home learning alongside classroom learning. It needs to be good quality. This is additional work. As reps, what should we be advising members?
These are 2 important questions that we might not be able to give full attention to at this time. Workload, we are against workload going up. And if we're maintaining home learning, we think that's the work for clinically vulnerable, clinically extremely vulnerable people so that they can be at home. But there can't be 2 sets of workload. Jeremy's question about industrial action, we are absolutely not saying that we can't take industrial action. We can take industrial action on these questions, and we will be prepared to take industrial action over safety questions at your workplace. You know, we'll go through obviously all the steps that you try and get through beforehand. There can then be, it takes time under legalities to do an industrial action ballot, but actually we find in most cases just saying we are going to do an industrial action ballot, if we've got support from the members, that often has the effect. Now, Jeremy asks for reassurance that Section 44 will work. And there is a problem with that. Section 44 gives protections to workers against having their pay docked or being disciplined if they have a reasonable belief that there is a serious and imminent danger to their health. Now, that question of whether their belief is reasonable can be tested in various procedures. And we don't know how it will work when Public Health England say there is no risk, you know, there is no serious risk. Clinically vulnerable people, the shielding is lifted. So we can't give absolute reassurance that Section 44 would work in those sorts of circumstances. It'll turn on, you know, if we're going against all the government guidance, then all the bodies that look at these things, they may not support us. So we think industrial action will quite often be the best route. It means collectivizing the issue. It means all the staff who are not vulnerable, as well as the staff who are vulnerable, saying, look, some of us are happy to be here. We don't feel as vulnerable. We're okay. But like I said, Mrs. M, she's really vulnerable. We want her to be at home doing the work that can be done from home. And that it's a collective stance that we take is the best route forward.
Thank you. Jane?
Yeah, and just quickly, following on from what Kevin says about Section 44, it is an individual right. It's always been an individual right. In September, it's more and more going to be about the individual circumstances. So if you take an extreme example, let's say we have a school where they decide not to clean anymore. At that point, we could probably say that Section 44 kicks in because there is a serious and imminent risk of danger. And that's a really extreme example, but what I'm trying to explain is there may well be individual circumstances where we can still use it.
Thank you. And Mark, as we've come to the end of the meeting.
Nothing to add.
Okay. I want to say firstly, thank you very much for all of the questions. There were so many for us to get through. We do record them all and we do add them to our FAQ so that we can try and make sure that we're covering the things that are coming in. There are a couple of things that we mentioned with everyone to do. That is absolutely vital, to read and share your checklists and your risk assessments with all NEU members in the school. It's really important that we review this when it's in place and we encourage communication, because what might be for a support staff who's working with one-on-one, or a support staff who's moving between classrooms, or a SENCO, or a class teacher, or a subject teacher is going to be very different. And we need to make sure that we include all of those circumstances when we're looking at risk assessments, so that everyone has a feed in. It's vital that we have open communication with our own members and also with SLT. And we need to say that we are not being difficult. This is not about being difficult. It's about doing what the National Education Union has done since the start of this lockdown and this pandemic, saving lives, protecting the NHS, and providing good education for the pupils that we teach. We want to make sure our schools are open, but we also want to make sure that our members and our communities are safe. This pandemic has proved one thing that we have always known, that our nurseries, our schools and our colleges and all of those staff in there are at the heart of every community. And we need to make sure that we carry on working with our communities and working together. Please don't feel you're alone. There are other things that we're always doing, the pay rise issue and the pay that Kevin talked about, but also the petition to sign with regards to next year's GCSEs and A-levels. If you're in nursery and primary, it's still important that we stand together and we make sure that our voices are heard. Please make a comment into the chat if you think we could do anything further. Please also take care of yourselves. It's a few more days till many of us return. Some have already. And thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you.